Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Williams, and this unit will be continuing our conversation on stimulus control. Specifically, I want to talk about teaching stimulus control, specifically to individuals who haven't acquired stimulus discrimination abilities. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And so these are basically tips for teachers and trainers. One of the things that I think is important to talk about is how we go about when we're teaching stimulus discriminations, how we can make our teaching and training more effective. And I have there's a big list of things that you can do to help facilitate the acquisition of different stimulus discriminations. So when you want a stimulus, use instructions. If you have verbal subjects, if you have individuals who can understand and respond to language, you can explain it to them. That's a great place to start. And then you can let them have experience, and that will cement what they've learned. Certainly if you're working with nonverbal individuals or working with animals, you have to rely on just experiential training. But if you do have verbal individuals, you can explain the rules. Also, allowing your subjects to actively respond to the stimuli that you're showing them, that you're having them look at, having them touch it, having them pick it up, having them hand it to you, having them point to it, having them point to it and say what the stimulus is. The more they interact with the stimulus, the faster they're going to acquire the discrimination. The next one I'm not completely sold on. Your book says that you should try to minimize errors, minimize the opportunities for them to make an error. In other words, you want to facilitate a lot of success. Now, there is something called errorless discrimination training, where the goal is to have the subject never make a mistake. But I think it's also important to experience the S delta. I think it's important to experience when the behavior is exhibited incorrectly or when they don't quite respond properly, that they don't get the reinforcer. And sometimes I think making a few mistakes can actually really increase the salience of being successful. So you certainly do want to have more success than you do failure. I think you want to have lots and lots of success, and a few failures can help to punctuate what it is that they're doing properly and what it is that they're not doing correctly. Sorry about that. You want to maximize the number of trials. You want to give them lots of practice. So lots of practice with lots of success. Those two things together are very, very powerful when it comes to acquiring a new discrimination. You know what they say? They say, perfect practice makes perfect. And so getting it right many, many times and doing it many, many times means that you're going to get better and better at the discrimination. You can use prompts. We'll talk about prompting and fading later in more detail, but you can prompt someone. You can help by moving their hand or giving them the first letter of the word. There are lots of ways to prompt it, and then you can then later slowly fade out those prompts. It can help if you help. One of the ways you can help is to make the stimuli that they're going to be working on really distinctive and novel and different from each other, so that they're easy to tell apart. If you have to exaggerate their difference initially, you can do that, and then you can fade back to the more naturalistic occurring stimuli that they would encounter in the real world. So use verbal cues. You can use verbal prompting. Try to keep the relationship between the training stimulus and the goal stimulus similar. So if you're going to be training people how to cross the street, try to use signs and cues in the classroom that are consistent with what they're going to be seeing in the real world. Don't make them so different that when they get out in the real world, they have no idea what they're doing. So you want to try and keep those stimuli fairly similar. The rate at which you present stimuli, the order in which you present stimuli can have an effect on stimulus discrimination. You can go too slow, you can go too fast. So trying to find a nice, comfortable pace is a good thing. Always ending on a good note. Try to use stimulus-specific reinforcers. So if you are teaching a child how to cross the street and you're doing it in a classroom setting initially, then you might have their favorite teacher on the opposite side of the quote-unquote street, and when they cross the street, they get a big hug from their favorite teacher saying, you did it, you did it. They were right there to receive them. So trying to tie the reinforcement in some way to the behavior that you're training. If you're training different kinds of foods, let them eat the food. You know, if you're trying to teach them a difference between apples and oranges, and when they get it right, you let them have the apple or you let them have the orange, that's going to be more salient than if you just say, good job. If they've had some pre-training or if they've had some pre-exposure to the stimuli, be aware that it will make it harder. So when teaching individuals how to cross the street, those individuals who have little or no experience are actually easier to teach than people who have been walked across the street without paying any attention to anything. So, for example, I'll give you an example. The crossing signals now that make noise, they will say walk, walk, and they actually speak to you. But if you've been there and you've been accompanied by a caregiver or a parent who's walked you across the street every single time, that you can habituate to those sounds, and as a result, when you're trying to learn the behavior for yourself, you're not cueing in on some of the signals that are out there, like the auditory signals. So that can be a tough thing. I know that people who train guide dogs have trouble with guide dogs that have been exposed to too much city, the sound of cars and the sound of streets, because they've learned to sort of habituate to them and they don't pay attention when they're learning, and so it's a little bit harder for them. And then gradually, if you start out with artificial discriminative stimuli and SDs and S deltas, then you're going to need to gradually shift to more naturalistic versions. So if you start out with things that are very artificial, for example, stop signs or walk signs and don't walk signs on a piece of paper, little tiny versions on a piece of paper, are not the same as the neon ones that they're going to see. And so shifting you may have to make them gradually bigger, and then you may have to lift them up, and then you may have to move them up into an area that approximates where they would occur in the real world. So it'll take some gradual work to shift to a more naturalistic stimulus. All right. Factors that you might want to consider that have an effect on stimulus control. So when you're working with children, one of the first things that we need to train is what we call the pre-attending skill. Being able to look at the teacher and to look at materials when requested, knowing to look where you point, listening to what the teacher says, being able to sit quietly. These are all skills that come before you really can pay attention and learn. You have to be able to do these basic skills. And so those are very important that they have when you're going to sit down and do any kind of stimulus control teaching or training. Excuse me. Stimulus salience. How salient the stimuli are, how different they are from each other, those are all very important. Having really noticeable, salient, grab your attention kind of stimuli are easier to train than stimuli that are very subtle. Masking and overshadowing. You have to be careful with your stimuli, that some aspect of your stimulus isn't going to grab their attention away from the main part of the stimulus. So I've shown you some pictures. I'm trying to see if I have any examples in this. I don't think I have a whole lot of them. I don't in this series, but Actually, maybe I do up here. Yeah, so here, I'll give you an example. Up here, when we're looking at the teaching kids to cross the street, if the individuals are more focused on the outline here rather than the individual, or they're focusing on the black space rather than on the images themselves, can have an effect on their, it can mask or it can overshadow their learning, and it can create a problem. So, and there's more on that in your book. And of course, the use of prompting. Prompting can be very, very useful. You can use verbal prompting, you can use modeling, you can use physical guidance, you can use vocal guidance, you can use prompts on the stimuli themselves. There are lots of ways that you can use prompting. But when you use prompting, because the prompts won't be there in the natural environment, you'll need to fade them out. All right, so I wanted to give you an example of stimulus control and its use in a real-world setting. So I like to call this also known as learning to do the right thing at the right time in the right in the right place. So this is a study by Glynn and Thomas. It's an old study from 1974. It was conducted in Auckland, New Zealand, and it was done in the Auckland schools. And they were brought into a classroom. There were 34 children in the classroom. And there were 9 children who had serious attention problems. They were, in addition to having poor attention, they were disruptive and they had very poor in-seat behavior. They were on task less than 50% of the time. And Glynn and Thomas decided to use stimulus control to do an antecedent intervention. So their antecedent was that they were going to produce 2 charts that the children were supposed to pay attention to. So the biggest problem was trouble with on-task behavior in the classroom setting, and the average for this group was they were only on task 49%, a little over 49% of the time. So half of the time they were doing their work, but the other half of the time they were completely off task. And so the training program that was developed was based on stimulus control and prompting. And so they developed 2 signs that the children could check to see if they were on task. When you've got that many kids, when you have 34 kids in a classroom, it's very hard to do an intervention at the individual level. And so this study was designed for the children to gather their own data. So the system was a self-monitoring system. They were given checklists, and the teacher did periodic checking for cheating. And so the children were given checklists, and there were the SDs were signs that were put at the front of the room that were that listed the appropriate behaviors that they could be doing whenever the buzzer went off. I'll talk about that in a minute. So here are the signs. The first sign said, look at the teacher, stay in your seat, be quiet. And the second sign said, work at your place, write in your books, read instructions on the blackboard. And those are the 6 behaviors that are considered on-task behaviors for these children. There was an observing stimulus. This was a beep. It was a little timer that would beep periodically every 2 minutes. And the children marked on their data collection sheet when the beeper went off. They would look up, they would look at those 6 possible outcomes and decide, was I doing one of those things? And if they were, they got to put a check mark in their box. And the reinforcer that they received was that each check mark equaled 1 minute of free playtime in the games and toys room later in the day. So they are earning reinforcement, but it's delayed. The big thing is being able to look up, identify whether or not they're using one of the 6 behaviors that are approved for on-task behavior, and to be able to mark it on their sheet with a check mark. see here. There we go. Hello. So here are the data. Oh, here we go. And the results were that the on-task behavior increased to approximately 91% for these 9 children. So here are the data. These are the 9 children. Here, I'm going to use my cursor. Here are the 9 children here. And these are the number of, these are mean percentage of on-task behaviors overall across all the phases. So here's baseline. Here's self-control, where they're just trying to behave appropriately. They're making their best effort. Then they return to baseline, and then they did self-control plus the discriminative stimulus cueing that allowed them to determine whether they were on task or not. And if you look, you can look at the scores themselves, but if you just look at the means, I mean, in baseline they were at 49.6%. By the self-control alone, they rose to 70%. That was a big change. And many people would have stopped there and said that that's good enough. So they went back to baseline and it dropped back to 50%. And then they instituted the self-control combined with the cueing of the signs. And it rose to 91%. So here's a graph of those data as well. So here are the 9 children, and here's baseline, self-control, baseline, and self-control plus cueing. And you'll notice that they're kind of all over the map. It's a very noisy process until you get to the end. And if you look down this list, the kids are all well above 90%. They're doing very well. Some kids are doing amazing. I mean, you look at this little guy here. He's incredible. Very, very useful and very productive use of stimulus control over their behavior to improve on-task behavior. So the final conclusions is basically that using discriminative stimuli combined with arranged contingencies like positive reinforcement and for getting to play more for each check mark that you observe. So using both positive and negative outcomes can effectively change behavior. But it's important to remember that gaining stimulus control may take some time. These kids were typically functioning children, so they just were very inattentive. And so sometimes it takes a while. It doesn't happen overnight. Participants may need to experience both positive and negative consequences in the presence of the SDs and or SPs. They really have to know what stimuli go with what. It's important to remember that when you're using antecedent procedures like stimulus control, that the rules of positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment still apply. They just apply in the presence of particular stimuli so that the individuals can learn which stimulus goes with which outcome. And it is the ability of a stimulus or an SD to signal which contingencies are in place that gives them that control over our behavior. And the more reliable they are, the better we learn them and the more likely they'll become automatic. So I'm going to stop here. The last lecture was a little long, so I'm going to stop here and we'll have a short little lecture to finish up the stimulus control part of Unit 5. So have a good day and we'll see you later.